everyone! Welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. We've made a lot of granny square motifs here over the years on the channel, and this week we thought we'd try something a little different and show you how to make a granny rectangle motif. Just like a granny square, these things are great use of scraps, and you can use them to make a whole lot of different projects. In fact, you can even mix rectangles in with classic granny squares so long as you use the same number of rows. If you make a granny square using, say, 4 rows, same hook, same yarn, it'll be the same width across as the short side of your granny rectangle. So picture a blanket, a row of squares, and a row of rectangles, a row of squares, and a row of rectangles, a row of squares, and a row of rectangles. They are just as much fun to make as a granny square, and they can definitely bring a little bit of interest to your next project. So let's grab our hooks, grab our yarn, we'll head on over to the granny table, and we'll stitch it up together. Like all motifs, granny rectangles can be made using any yarn fiber, any yarn size, and any hook size. It just depends on the overall project that you're working on. But for demonstrative purposes today, I'm using a size 4 medium weight yarn that's 100% acrylic. 4 rows, which I will be demonstrating, works out to make a granny rectangle that's a little bit bigger than my hand, so that's a pretty good sized motif. And this uses between 20 and 25 yards. It's a great scrap project, so if you're using multiple colors like I am, that's not a lot of yardage per color. You want a pair of scissors, a yarn needle, and I'm using a 5.5mm hook. It's also known as an I or a 9. And of course you can use any hook size you want as long as it fits comfortably with the yarn you've chosen. And once you've got all that together, we can get started.
Visit our shop and purchase a pattern. You'll help support our show. And we'll put a link to our shop in the description box down below.
The granny rectangle I'm demonstrating today has a shell side ratio of 2, or a difference of 2. And by that I mean the short side of your granny rectangle should have the number of shells in it that's equal to the number of rows of your rectangle. So as you can see, I've done 4 rows, red, orange, yellow, green. On my 4th row, I have 4 shells across my short side. 1, 2, 3, 4. So 4 rows, 4 shells along the short side. The 2 shell ratio difference means that on the long side, I will always have 2 more shells than I have across the short side. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shells along the long side. And it works for every single row. For example, row 3, I should have 3 shells across the short side, which I do. Plus 2, I should have 5 shells across the long side, which you can see that I do. So that will help you as you go forward to make sure that you're not accidentally adding or skipping any shells as you work different rounds of your granny rectangle. Granny rectangles are worked from the center out, like a granny square, but rather than starting from a ring, we're actually going to start from a little foundation chain row. So we're going to begin with a slip knot. And we're going to chain 10. Make sure you have 10 chains, and then we're going to count back 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 chains from the hook. So you want the 4th chain back from the hook. And into this chain, we're going to begin working a very familiar looking granny square corner. So the first 3 chains here count as a double crochet. We're going to work 2 more double crochet into that 4th chain from the hook. And I like to hold on to it somewhat tightly while I'm working my crochet stitches, just so that I don't pull that chain out of, to make it too big. I want to keep it somewhat small. We're going to chain 2. Chain 2 makes a corner space. And like a granny square, a granny rectangle still only has 4 corners. And into that same chain, we're going to work 3 more double crochets. And of course, 3 double crochet stitches equals 1 granny shell. So just like a granny square. Like a granny square, I like to chain 1 between my shells just to give it a little bit of breathing space and room to work successive shells into. So chain 1 between all shells when you work along the sides. You only chain 2 when you're turning a corner. Back to our foundation chain row, we're going to skip 2 chains, find the 3rd. So 1, 2, here's number 3. and we're going to work 3 double crochets or a shell into it. Chain 1, that's your spacer. Skip 2 more chains. You should have 1 chain left. This is the last guy here right next to your knot, and we're going to work 2 corners into this. So this is where a rectangle differs a little bit from a granny square when you're starting. So let's start the whole side of that granny. We're going to start with 3 double crochet. That's the last shell along the long side here. So 3 double crochet, chain 2, because we're turning a corner. This is going to be our second corner space. We're still using that chain there. We're going to work 3 more double crochet into it. Chain 2, because now we're turning the other corner, and still working into that chain, 3 more double crochet. So shell, chain 2, shell, chain 2, shell, all into that last chain, and that gives us the edge, the complete long side, the little short side, and the beginning of the second long side. So as you can already see, you have 1 shell across the short side of your granny rectangle as it begins. Add 2, that's the ratio, and you should have 3 shells across the first long side that you completed. So we're already over halfway done here. Before you leave, you're going to chain 1 just to create that little spacer, and then we're going to work up the bottom of the foundation chain row. So you can work over top of your short tail or leave it out and weave it in later. Very obviously, we want to work our middle shell of that long side into the bottom of that shell from the other side. So right into that space there, right underneath that other shell, 3 double crochet. Chain 1. And we're going to complete this row and our last corner into the same chain that we began all that work into. So 3 double crochet all into that first chain that we worked our first 2 shells into. Chain 2. And you're going to find the top of the chain 3. So there's the top of that double crochet. So right next to it, into the top of that chain 3, you're going to join with a slip stitch. Okay, so before we go on, this is what we've got. I like to lay it down, find the 4 chain 2 corners, pull it out, and you can really see that rectangle. You should have 3 shells along each long side and 1 shell across each short side. And that is the first row of your granny rectangle complete. If you're not going to change colors, you can do this. So you slip stitch into the next stitch, slip stitch into the next stitch, and then slip stitch into that chain 2 corner. So if you're not changing colors, then you can just slip stitch right across to that chain 2 and wait. If you are changing colors, like me, after you join with a slip stitch, snip your yarn, fasten off. You can take a moment to weave in your tails or leave them all to the back and weave them in later. And then we're going to join our yarn with a slip stitch in any chain 2 corner. Of course, those of you who slip stitched over here, you'll be in this corner, but it doesn't matter what corner you start row 2 in. I just like to start in a corner. I feel it makes for a nice, even, neat motif. Grab your next color and we'll start row 2. We're going to take color number 2 for row number 2, make a slip knot. And we're going to join, you can join in any corner, but just so that we're all starting in the same place, we're going to join in the same corner that if you haven't changed colors, you would have slip stitched across into, just so it all looks the same. Slip stitch into the corner to join. And just like a traditional granny square, we're going to chain 3 to begin. That counts as a double crochet. Finish that first shell with 2 more double crochet stitches. And before we leave, we're going to complete the corner, chain 2 for the new corner space, and into the same space work 3 more double crochet. So chain 2, 3 double crochet. shell, chain 2, shell. That's a corner. Chain 1 for a spacer, and this will look pretty familiar to you. When you're working a regular granny square, across the sides you're looking for all the little chain 1 spaces. Every chain 1 space gets 1 shell. 1 shell is 3 double crochet. There's a shell. Remember to chain 1 for that nice space. There's another chain 1 space, so it gets a shell, 3 double crochet. Chain 1. Next space, oh, it's a chain 2 space, so that means we're going to make a corner. Shell, chain 2, shell, or 3 double crochet. Chain 2 for the new corner. Before you leave, 3 more double crochet, all worked into the same corner. All right, chain 1, that creates a little space because now our short sides are getting bigger. And the next space we're going to work into is a chain 2 corner. So we're going to repeat what we just did. Shell, chain 2, shell. All into that same chain 2 corner over here. So there's my first 3 double crochets or my shell. Chain 2, that creates my new corner. And before I leave, 3 more double crochet, all worked into the chain 2 corner space. So if it's a chain 2 space, it gets 2 shells and a chain 2 corner. If it's a chain 1 space, like this, need to chain 1 before you leave, it gets 1 shell, right? All right, here we are so far. Our first long side is complete. It should have 1, 2, 3, 4 shells in it, and our first short side is complete, 2 shells, or we're on row 2, so a short side has 2 shells across the short side, and because of the 2 shell difference ratio between short and long sides, the long side has to have 2 more shells than the short side. 1, 2, 3, 4, and it does. So that beautiful little math ratio just keeps working out perfectly as we go. We're just going to finish up now. This is a chain 1 space, so a chain 1 space gets 1 shell or 3 double crochet. Chain 1, that's your little space. Next space is a chain 1 space, so it gets 1 shell or 3 double crochet. Chain 1, and the next space is a chain 2 corner, so we need to work shell, chain 2, shell into it. 3 double crochet, that becomes the last shell along the last long side. Chain 2, that becomes the new corner, and before we leave, 3 more double crochet or 1 shell, and that completes the corner. It also will be the last shell in row 2. When you finish a row, don't forget to chain 1. You still need to complete that last little space so you have a space to work into for row 3 or whatever row you're moving into. That will bring you right up against the chain 3 that we began with. You can join with a slip stitch to the top of it. Again, if you're not changing colors, just slip stitch into each of the next 2 stitches and right into that corner space, and then you can begin row 3 from there. If you are changing colors like me, snip your yarn, fasten off, and you can leave your tails out to the back or weave them in. At the end of every row, I like to find those 4 corners, pull them out with my thumbs and forefingers, just sort of stretch it a little bit so I can really see that pretty little rectangle shape happening. And I do a count. Short side, row 2, 2 shells. Long side, plus 2, 4 shells. Math is perfect. Things become even clearer in row 3. That pattern starts to resemble a typical granny square a lot more. It's just that you always have 2 more shells along the long side than you do along the short side. Let's get into row 3. I'm changing colors, so like any color change, I'm going to start the slip knot on my hook. I'm going to start in a corner space. If you slip stitched across to the corner, we're all going to start in the same place. So if you're already there, just wait a second. Join with a slip stitch, and we all chain 3 to begin row 3. Chain 3 counts as a double crochet. Finish that shell with 2 more double crochet. We're in a corner, so we want to create a new corner space. We chain 2, and before we leave, 3 more double crochet into the corner. So shell, chain 2, shell still happens in every single corner, and of course there are only 4 corners. So you will only ever have 4 chain 2 spaces. Before you leave, chain 1, that creates a spacer for the next row to be worked into. And then right along the first side, you've got 1, 2, 3 chain 1 spaces. So you're going to make a shell here, a shell here, and a shell here, and then we'll be up to our next corner. So 3 double crochet or 1 shell in each of those 3 chain 1 spaces all the way across. And don't forget to chain 1 in between each. So across the first long side, you've got your corner. We started here, shell, chain 2 shell in the corner space. We worked a single shell and a chain 1 in each of those chain 1 spaces from the previous row across. That brings us up to our next chain 2 corner space, and every single chain 2 corner space gets the same treatment. 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet. Or shell, chain 2 shell. There's the first one. The chain 2 creates the new corner, and 3 more double crochet finishes it off. And now our short sides are starting to look a little easier to work, and they look a little more similar to our longer sides, because now our next space is an actual chain 1 space. So before we leave the corner, chain 1 for a spacer, work a shell into that chain 1 space. Remember, a chain 1 space gets 1 shell. 3 double crochet, and before you leave, another little chain 1 to create the next space for the next row. Then we're up to a corner again, 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 1 before you leave, and it's the same thing all the way across here. If you are at a chain 1 space, you put in 1 shell, 3 double crochet, chain 1 for spacer, 3 double crochet, chain 1, 3 double crochet, chain 1, and then we'll be back to our last corner, and we'll be almost finished row 3. So here we are in row 3, just like the other side. I've worked a single shell into each of those chain 1 spaces. I've made sure there's a chain 1 in between each of them. Chain 1, the next space is a corner, and every chain 2 corner gets shell, chain 2 shell. So 3 double crochet, chain 2, that creates your new corner, and 3 double crochet. Chain 1 before you leave the corner, and like the other side, we've got a chain 1 space now in the middle. Because it's a chain 1 space, it gets 1 shell or 3 double crochet. This is the last shell of side 3. Chain 1 before you leave for good, because you always want to have 1 chain after every shell, unless it's a corner, chain 2. That brings you up to the chain 3 that began. Slip stitch to join. If you're continuing with the same color, same thing, just slip stitch across and into the next chain 2 space, so we all start in a corner. I am changing colors, so I'm going to snip my yarn, fasten off, and let's take a look at that math. I'm going to pull out my 4 corners here. Row 3, a short side should have 3 shells. 1, 2, 3. The ratio is 2, which means that the long side should have 3 more shells than the short side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's, of course, the exact same on the opposite side. So the math is still working out beautifully. All right, let's do row 4 together. Row 4 is a start just like every other row, and from here on out you can keep repeating row 4. It's very easy to see what you have to do next, which is why I like to get us up to row 4. So as you can see, your short sides are starting to have the little chain 1 spaces now. You're going to work a single shell into each of those. Remember to chain 1 between your shells, and every time you get to a chain 2 space you work shell, chain 2, shell, or 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, like this, and then always chain 1 before you leave. We're all going to start in the same corner space. You can start in any corner space if you're changing colors, but just so we're all on the same page, every row begins with a chain 3. That chain 3 counts as a double crochet. It's also the first stitch in our first shell. So 2 more double crochet all into that same space. Chain 2. That's our new corner. And 3 more double crochet all worked into the same space. Now you might notice that I'm using a yarn that's a little bit lighter weight than the other yarns I've used so far. These are all technically a size 4 category, but as you know, not everything in the same weight category is necessarily the same. So I'm going to be aware of the slight change in the weight of my yarn, and I'm going to adjust my tension. So this is also a fun little exercise you can do to not necessarily change your hook size, but to be aware of the change in your yarn. And you can, I'm trying to try and loosen up on my tension so that my shells still relatively end up being the same size as the other ones. Chain 1 as you're leaving your corner. And of course, across my first side, I now have 1, 2, 3, 4 chain 1 spaces. Each one of those is going to get 3 double crochet and a chain 1 or a shell, and a chain 1 because I want to make sure I'm chaining 1 in between my shells. And so that's all I've got to do. Shell, chain 1, shell, chain 1 into each of those spaces all the way across. So here I am working across my first long side of row 4. I just finished my last single shell. My next space is a chain 2 corner. Before I get into it, I make sure I chain that 1 little chain for a spacer, because that's going to create the new chain 1 space. It'll be like this before the corner for the next row. And into that corner, shell, chain 2, shell. 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet. So that's shell, chain 2, shell, worked into the corner. Before I leave, chain 1, gotta create that space. And now across my short side, I've got little chain 1 spaces. You know what to do. 1 shell if it's a chain 1 space. So that's 3 double crochet. And before you leave, chain 1 for a spacer. So there's my 3 double crochet. I chain 1. The next space is still a single chain 1 space. So I do 3 double crochet, of course I chain 1, and the next space is a corner, so it's just like every other corner. Shell, chain 2, shell, and chain 1 before you go. You're going to repeat that simple little pattern all the way around. So shell, chain 2, shell, into the corner, chain 1 before you leave. Shell, chain 1 into each of those chain 1 spaces, shell, chain 2, shell, chain 1 into that little corner space there, shell, chain 1, shell, chain 1, and I'll catch up with you right back at the beginning. As you finish every row, and every row finishes the same way, don't forget after you've worked the last shell into your last little chain 1 space to chain 1 before you join to the top of the chain 3, because you still want to make sure you're completing that chain 1 space for the next row. So slip stitch to join. Once again, if you're continuing with the same yarn, you can just slip stitch across to the chain 2 corner and then begin your next row if you want. If you're changing colors, you snip your yarn, fasten off like me, and if you're finished with your rectangle, like I am, just join with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 3. Even if you never changed color, you don't need to slip stitch across to the corner because you're done your row. And then you can fasten off and weave in your tails. I try to weave my tails in underneath all of the same colored stitches, and I've done that now for my other 3 rows, so you can't see where I've woven them in because I wove them in underneath similar color stitches. And then, even though I'm done, I'm still going to pull out those 4 corners so I can see that nice rectangle shape happening. And these make such a fun motif, so you can create any kind of project that you would with a granny square, except now you've got blocks that are slightly taller than they are wide, so you can put them together like this. You can put them together like bricks. You can sew them together like bricks in a baby blanket or something. This is such a fun little motif to play with. And of course, like all our other motifs, a fantastic scrap beater. And you can use up all of that crazy stash yarn. And there you go, a granny rectangle motif. That is a rectangle using the 2 shell ratio difference between the short side and the long side. That's a handy little technique you can use to keep track of what row you're on and how many shells you should have on each side. Plus, I think that makes a really attractive granny rectangle shape. And of course, you can keep adding rows until those rectangles are as big as you like. I hope you enjoyed making that along with us this week, and we'll see you soon here on the Jayda and Stitches show. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have a great week. Bye, everybody!
Hi, everybody! Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.